Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to MusicForever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from Bring Me the Horizon, Amo. Now Bring Me the Horizon is a group that I've had very varying opinions on over the years when it comes to the different albums that they've released. When it comes to the band's earliest works, I really wouldn't consider myself much of a fan at all. I'm not a big fan of deathcore in general, but I even feel like the deathcore that this group had been releasing in their earliest days was some of the worst that I've heard from that genre. However, as the band progressed more into a more typical metalcore sound over the years, I feel like the quality of their work slowly got better and better with every release. And I feel like with the band's last studio album, That's the Spirit, that was the first album from this group that I could really say that I found myself really enjoying from front to back. It was an album that was really divisive amongst fans, given that it was a much poppier album than anything that the band had put out before. But honestly, I think that, at least based on that last album, that Bring Me the Horizon is a better pop rock band than they are a metal one. And I was very interested to see where this band was going to take their sound on their next studio album. Was it going to get poppier than That's the Spirit? Were they going to make a return to their older sound perhaps? Was it going to be something entirely new that we didn't see coming? And with this new album here that we finally got from them, I could say that it's kind of a mix of the first and last of those things that I said before. This is definitely an album that's poppier than That's the Spirit and everything else that the band has put out in the past. However, it does have a few tricks up its sleeve that are a bit different and unexpected and don't really result in this album feeling like another attempt from a rock band to go in a more pop-focused sound like so many bands over the past couple of years have tried to do. This album definitely feels like a natural progression from That's the Spirit in a sense. However, while I really like That's the Spirit, I feel like this new album here isn't quite as enjoyable as the last one. Overall, I have to say that I have very mixed opinions on this album in many senses of that word. Generally on this album, the band keeps that mixture of pop rock and the occasional heavier moment that they had formulated for themselves on That's the Spirit, though they occasionally do mix in some more electronic moments into that and some other just odder moments to kind of mix things up, for better or for worse. The opening track on this album, I Apologize If You Feel Something, is one of the most electronic influence on the entire album. And it's a track that overall I think is just kind of there at the end of the day. It doesn't really serve all that much of a purpose on the album, it just kind of exists. I almost feel like to increase the runtime of the album a bit more. And that's one of the biggest problems I have with this album, is that at times it just feels a bit bloated, and I feel like there's some tracks that are mixed in here that don't really need to be there, and are just kind of there for the sake of existing. I can say the same thing for the track Ouch that comes later in the track listing. Another shorter, very electronic track that I just kind of feel like is there to be there. And the outro to the closing track, I don't know what to say. While I do feel like this song in general is one of the stronger moments on the album, I feel like the outro to this track just runs a bit too long overall. It didn't need to be as long as it was. You could probably cut off like 2 minutes or so of its runtime and just make this cut, a bit shorter, a bit more concise. And the same goes for the album overall too. And it wouldn't really change my overall listening experience. Well, except for the better, really. It wouldn't change my overall opinions on the core part of the song, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I feel that the stretch of 3 tracks following the opening song on the album are probably the strongest on this entire thing. The song Mantra, that kind of kicks off the stretch of tracks, is just a pretty solid, straightforward rock track. The band doesn't really throw any curveballs at you on this song, but for what it's worth, it's a pretty enjoyable song through and through. It's got a pretty catchy chorus to it as well, and I feel like this is more of a proper kickoff to the album in a sense than the actual opening track, and it does that role rather nicely. The second of these 3 tracks that you get here, Nihilist Blues, that features Grimes, is a really strangely interesting track overall. It's very electronic. It's very different than anything that the band has done before, and I think that's why I like the track as much as I do. This ends up being one of the most unique tracks in the band's catalog thanks to the experimentation that they're going for here on this song, and it's one of the moments on the album where I feel like the experimentation really works in the band's favor. The third track here in this stretch of tracks, In the Dark, is just a really solid pop rock song at the end of the day. It's not super heavy or anything along those lines. You do have some of those electronic elements sneaking into this track as well, however, you do still have some very clear-cut rock moments on this thing as well. And it's just a pretty catchy track, one of the more lyrically interesting songs on this thing as well. Just a solid pop rock song at the end of the day. I occasionally want to throw the track Wonderful Life into this good stretch of songs on the album. However, it's just the one that I think is decent at the end of the day. It's one of the heavier moments on the album as well, but it didn't really blow me away or anything. However, immediately following this song, the album takes a massive nosedive in terms of its quality, starting with the track Ouch, which I already talked about before, and then followed up by the track Medicine, which is a really boring, straightforward pop rock track with some of the least interesting lyrics and instrumentation on the entire album. Not all too much to say about this one, it's just a really boring song overall. Within the stretch of 3 tracks that immediately follows Medicine are probably the worst 3 songs on the entire project. Sugar, Honey, Ice, and Tea just has some of the worst lyrics across the entire project, even if the slightly heavier sound on this track does make it stand out a bit more from some of the other tracks in the track listing. The song Why You Gotta Kick Me When I'm Down is one that takes some influence from hip-hop with some almost rapped vocals on the song. Not really sure what they were going for with this one. This album does take a lot of new sounds into it, but to take hip-hop in just one track here ends up with this one song feeling really out of place compared to some of the other songs on this thing. And it's not like a lot of the other aspects of the tracks were really interesting enough to save some of the weaker moments that popped up on this thing. It's just a really awkward track that doesn't really do a whole ton for me. And then the track Fresh Bruises is one that just is kind of there, really. Like, this is the least interesting song on the entire album as far as I'm concerned. It's just kind of this big, jumbled, very electronic influenced mess that doesn't really do much except to meander and waste my time. I do think the track Mother Tongue that follows this stretch of pretty not good tracks is another one of the more solid cuts on the album. Once again, just a pretty solid pop rock song with a pretty catchy chorus to it. Not one that I think is super excellent or anything, not a song of the year or anything like that, but it still is a pretty decent track and one that I definitely enjoyed a lot more than a whole bunch of the tracks that preceded it. And the track Heavy Metal on this thing is a bit of an odd one, as the band addresses a lot of the people out there who didn't like the band following their change in sound with That's the Spirit. And it's kind of an odd song in the fact that the lyrics on this thing don't really tie into the album's themes of love that were present on all the other songs. It's just kind of this one track on the album that lyrically just feels like it came from a completely different album. But despite that fact, the heaviness in the track does make it one of the more interesting, I guess, overall. It's not a track that I hate, but it's not one that I'm in love with either, I guess. The closing track on this album, I don't know what to say, is one that pulls from a lot more diverse instrumentation, and it ends up being one of the more interesting cuts on the album as a result of that. Despite the long outro I talked about earlier kind of, making it less enjoyable, I still feel like it's one of the highlights on the album overall. And this album as a whole is one that I just really have a lot of mixed feelings on. There's lots of cuts on this thing that I think are pretty solid overall and are a nice continuation of what we got on That's the Spirit. However, at the same time, there's some tracks on this thing where I feel like the experimentation doesn't work out all that nicely and it just ends up with some really subpar tracks. Either that or the band is really playing in their comfort zone a bit too much and it just produces some pretty boring material. My opinions on a lot of the tracks on this album are really all over the place. My thoughts on this album as a whole are really all over the place. And really organizing my thoughts on this album is kind of difficult to do as a result of that. Really, I just had to go through all the tracks here on this album and talk about them individually because that's all I really knew how to do, at least in terms of approaching this in an easy format. So yeah, at the end of the day, I have very mixed opinions on this album. I think this thing is pretty average overall, which is kind of a shame because I do feel like some of the moments on this thing that are good happen to be really good overall, and I feel like if more of the album was like some of the highlights on this thing, this could have been possibly an even better album than That's the Spirit. However, some of the experimentation on this thing just doesn't, land correctly, and it ends up feeling kind of out there, or doesn't really mesh all too nicely with the band's more typical sound, and it just doesn't work at the end of the day, I guess. This is an album that I would recommend mostly to fans of the band who, of course, weren't exactly turned off by the band's last outing. If you like pop Bring Me the Horizon, then definitely give this a shot. You'll probably find some tracks on it that you enjoy, but whether or not you'll enjoy this thing from front to back is something that only you could answer, I guess, because I have very mixed opinions on this album. While I haven't seen any other reviews of this album, I know just the general consensus on this thing has been pretty mixed, just looking at some more general scores and people's just general opinions on social media and things like that. So, yeah, I guess my opinion does kind of fit in with what a lot of people are saying in regards to how my opinions are really mixed on this thing, but whether or not they're for the same reasons, I have no idea. But yeah, that is just my own personal opinion here on this album. Feel free to disagree and have your own opinion, and in fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on this album in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Thank you for watching, and stay golden.